Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases ever documented in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we proceed, I encourage you to drop a comment letting us know your current location and the precise time you are hearing this narration. We are genuinely curious about the places and hours, day or night, where these accounts find their audience. During the winter of 1912, the Springfield Republican carried a brief announcement regarding a domestic incident in Taney County, situated deep within the Ozark Mountains. The notice, a mere 3 paragraphs, mentioned that local officials had been summoned to probe the vanishing of a woman named Eliza Whitlock from her secluded homestead near the White River. The piece noted that her husband, Thomas Whitlock, asserted she had departed willingly following a marital disagreement. The article concluded by stating that no additional inquiry was considered necessary at that point. What the newspaper failed to report was that this minor story would mark the start of one of the most harrowing cases in Ozark lore. One that would stay largely hidden from public record for many years. The Whitlock land covered roughly 40 acres of rocky hillside close to the small community of Walnut Shade, about 15 miles south of Forsyth, the Taney County seat. The property featured a 2-story timber-framed dwelling, a modest barn, and several outbuildings. According to county documents from 1908, Thomas Whitlock had acquired the property after relocating from Springfield, where he had been employed as a clerk at Heer's department store. These same records depict Thomas as a man of quiet temperament and meticulous habits. His wife, Eliza, born Eliza Crawford, had worked as a schoolteacher in Christian County prior to their wedding in 1905. The couple had 2 offspring, Edward, who was 6 in 1912, and Mary, aged 4. People living nearby later remembered the Whitlocks as an intensely private family, seldom joining in community gatherings. Thomas would occasionally journey into Forsyth or Branson to purchase supplies, but after their first year on the property, Eliza was rarely observed beyond the homestead's borders. Such seclusion was hardly unusual for the region, where residences could be separated by miles of dense oak and pine woodlands, limestone bluffs, and steep ravines. The Ozarks had long served as a haven for those wishing to vanish, whether fleeing the law, escaping debts, or simply withdrawing from society altogether. Joseph Miller, whose family held the adjacent property to the east, later recounted that the Whitlocks appeared sufficiently content during their initial years on the homestead. In an interview conducted in 1952 with a researcher from the Missouri Historical Society, Miller recalled that Thomas was exacting about his property lines and mostly kept to himself, though he would offer a nod when our paths crossed. The missus was even more withdrawn, but the children seemed healthy and adequately dressed. Miller observed that in the autumn of 1911, roughly half a year before Eliza's disappearance, Thomas began making alterations to the property, including excavating what looked like a new root cellar behind the residence and reinforcing the doors with extra locks. The final verified sighting of Eliza Whitlock by anyone outside her immediate family occurred in November 1911, when Harriet Bowman, a midwife from Walnut Shade, visited the homestead after receiving word that Eliza was unwell. In a deposition given to the Taney County Sheriff in April 1912, Bowman stated that she found Eliza pale and distant, with a jittery demeanor, though she appeared to suffer from no obvious physical illness. Bowman reported that the house was unusually chilly despite a blazing fireplace, and Thomas remained present throughout the visit, fielding most of the questions addressed to his wife. When Bowman proposed that Eliza might gain from seeing a doctor in Forsyth, Thomas supposedly responded that the family could not bear such an expense and that his wife would improve with rest. County records indicate that Thomas Whitlock had been consistently withdrawing funds from the family's modest savings account at the Taney County Bank throughout the autumn of 1911. Bank ledgers preserved in the county archives show that Thomas removed nearly half of their savings between September and December of that year. The bank manager, Harold Winters, later remembered that Thomas had justified these withdrawals as necessary for home improvements and winter provisioning. Winters noted that such outlays were not atypical for homesteaders preparing for an Ozark winter, but the sum appeared excessive for a family of the Whitlocks' means. The winter of 1911-1912 proved especially severe in the Ozarks. Heavy snows in December and January left many remote homesteads cut off for weeks at a time, and it was not uncommon for families to have no outside contact until early spring. Weather records from the Springfield Weather Bureau indicate that temperatures in February 1912 dropped to near zero on several occasions, and snow cover persisted until mid-March. The isolation imposed by these conditions meant that abnormal activities could escape notice for extended intervals. It was during this period of seclusion, somewhere between late February and early March 1912, that Eliza Whitlock allegedly departed her family. The precise date of her disappearance was never definitively determined. Thomas Whitlock first mentioned his absence to Joseph Miller in late March, when Miller encountered him on the road to Forsyth. According to Miller's 1952 account, Thomas stated simply that the missus has gone away and offered no additional details. Miller, accustomed to his neighbor's reserved nature, did not press for more information. Archival records from the general store in Forsyth reveal that Thomas Whitlock's buying habits shifted noticeably in early March 1912. Store ledgers show that on March 4, he purchased an unusually large quantity of preserved provisions, coffee, and lamp oil, enough to sustain a household for several weeks without another trip to town. The store owner, Jeremiah Collins, noted in his personal journal, discovered after his death in 1938, that Thomas appeared agitated and reluctant to engage in casual conversation during this visit. Collins wrote that he asked after Mrs. Whitlock's health, to which Thomas responded sharply that she is not my concern at present. The matter might have stayed entirely private, if not for the involvement of Eliza's sister, Catherine Crawford, a Springfield resident who had not heard from Eliza since the previous autumn. Correspondence preserved in the Taney County Historical Society archives shows that Catherine wrote to the postmaster at Walnut Shade in early April 1912, asking about her sister's condition. When the postmaster informed her that Eliza had reportedly left her family, Catherine traveled to Taney County and requested that Sheriff James Harmon investigate the disappearance. Catherine Crawford's personal journal, donated to the Missouri State Archives by her granddaughter in 1961, offers insight into her apprehensions about her sister's circumstances. In an entry dated April 10, 1912, Catherine wrote, "I cannot believe that Eliza would willingly abandon her children." Since her marriage to Thomas, her letters had grown increasingly infrequent and guarded, but her devotion to Edward and Mary was evident in every word she wrote about them. "Something is terribly wrong, and I dread what I might uncover in Taney County." Sheriff Harmon's official report, dated April 18, 1912, documents his visit to the Whitlock homestead. Harmon reported that he found the property in good order, with Thomas and both children present. The children appeared adequately fed and clothed, though Harmon noted that both were unusually reticent during his visit. Thomas maintained that Eliza had left of her own accord, after expressing dissatisfaction with their isolated life, taking only a small valise with personal items. He claimed to have no knowledge of her destination, but suggested she might have returned to her family in Springfield. despite Catherine's insistence that her sister had not contacted any relatives. Harmon's report includes a brief description of his inspection of the house, which revealed no evidence of disturbance or struggle. He noted that Eliza's clothing and personal effects appeared to be missing from the bedroom drawers, supporting Thomas's claim that she had packed before departing. The sheriff concluded that there was insufficient proof of wrongdoing, and that, as an adult, Eliza had the right to leave her family if she chose. With Catherine Crawford's reluctant acquiescence to this verdict, the official inquiry came to a close. What Harmon's report did not mention, but what surfaced in his personal papers, discovered after his death in 1931, was that he had observed several troubling details during his visit to the Whitlock property. In a private notebook, separate from his official records, Harmon wrote, "Whitlock was too composed for a man recently abandoned. The children watched their father's face before answering any question, no matter how trivial. The boy began to speak about his mother, but stopped abruptly when Thomas cleared his throat. Most troubling was the freshly turned earth behind the house, which Whitlock claimed was a garden plot, though it was an odd time for planting and shaped more like a trench than a garden bed." Harmon's private note suggests that he harbored suspicions about Thomas Whitlock, but lacked sufficient evidence to pursue them further. The sheriff wrote, "Without a body or a witness, there is no crime to investigate." Mrs. Crawford's concerns, while understandable, do not constitute proof. In these hills, family matters are generally considered private, and the county lacks resources for extended investigations based on mere suspicion. This reluctance to act without concrete evidence reflected both the limited law enforcement capabilities and the cultural attitudes of rural Missouri in the early 20th century. Catherine Crawford returned to Springfield after her meeting with Sheriff Harmon, but her unease about her sister's fate persisted. According to her journal, she attempted to maintain contact with her niece and nephew by sending letters and small gifts, but received only brief, formal acknowledgments from Thomas in return. In June 1912, she traveled once more to Taney County, hoping to visit the children, but was turned away by Thomas, who informed her that her presence was disruptive to the household routine. Catherine's final journal entry regarding the matter, dated July 3, 1912, reads, "I fear I have failed Eliza. Without proof or legal standing, I cannot force my way into Thomas's home or remove the children. I can only pray that if Eliza is alive somewhere, she will find her way back to them, or at least to me." For several years, the disappearance of Eliza Whitlock remained a private affair, known only to her immediate family and a few locals. Thomas continued to manage the homestead, raising his children with occasional assistance from a local woman, Martha Jenkins, who came to help with household tasks several times a week. Jenkins, who began working at the Whitlock home in the summer of 1912, later told a neighbor that Thomas had instructed her never to discuss Eliza with the children, and to tell them, if they asked, that their mother would return when she was better. Jenkins was interviewed briefly by Sheriff Masterson during the 1952 investigation. By then an elderly woman living in a nursing home in Branson, she recalled several peculiar aspects of her employment at the Whitlock home. According to the transcript of this interview, preserved in the county archives, Jenkins stated that Thomas had established strict rules about certain areas of the property that were to be avoided. He would not allow anyone near the root cellar he had built, she said. Once when young Mary wandered toward it, Thomas grabbed her so roughly that she cried out. He later apologized, saying there were dangerous tools stored there that might harm the children. Jenkins also reported that Thomas frequently suffered from insomnia and would pace the house at night. On several occasions, she arrived in the morning to find him sitting at the kitchen table, apparently having been awake all night, muttering about keeping watch and maintaining the barriers. Jenkins admitted that she found these behaviors concerning, but attributed them to the stress of raising two children alone. Like many in the community, she was reluctant to interfere in what she considered private family matters. Edward and Mary Whitlock attended the one-room schoolhouse in Walnut Shade beginning in 1913. Their teacher, Abigail Thornton, noted in her personal diary that both children were abnormally withdrawn and that Edward, in particular, exhibited a worrying tendency toward prolonged silences. Thornton recorded an incident in October 1913 when a female visitor to the school attempted to engage Mary in conversation about her mother. According to Thornton, Mary became visibly distressed, and later that day, Thomas Whitlock arrived at the school, removed both children, and kept them home for nearly 2 weeks. Thornton's diary, which remained in private hands until being donated to the Taney County Historical Society in 1965, contains several other observations about the Whitlock children. She noted that Edward often arrived at school with dark circles under his eyes, explaining that the noises kept him awake at night. When asked what noises he meant, the boy refused to elaborate. Mary, though younger, seemed to adapt better to school life, but displayed what Thornton described as an unusual preoccupation with burial. The teacher recorded finding a series of drawings in Mary's desk depicting what appeared to be a figure lying underground with flowers growing above. In the spring of 1914, according to Thornton's diary, Edward Whitlock's behavior became increasingly concerning. He began having what the teacher described as episodes. Periods when he would become unresponsive, staring fixedly at nothing. Following one such episode, during which Edward had whispered repeatedly, "She's still digging," Thornton attempted to discuss the boy's welfare with Thomas. Her diary entry for April 12, 1914, reads, "Mr. Whitlock received my concerns with cold anger. He informed me that his son's education was his business, and my observations were unwelcome. I fear for these children, but what can I do? Mr. Whitlock has threatened to remove them from school permanently if I pursue the matter." The Whitlock family continued their isolated existence until 1917, when Thomas abruptly sold the homestead and moved with the children to Kansas City. County records indicate that the property was sold to James Harker, a cattle rancher from Arkansas, for significantly less than its assessed value. Harker later commented to neighbors that Thomas seemed eager to conclude the sale quickly and had accepted the first offer presented. The timing of the Whitlock family's departure coincided with increased scrutiny from local authorities. Records from the Taney County School Board, discovered during the 1952 investigation, revealed that Abigail Thornton had finally reported her concerns about the Whitlock children to the county superintendent in March 1917. The superintendent had subsequently initiated an inquiry, sending a letter to Thomas requesting a meeting to discuss the children's welfare. According to post office records, this letter was delivered on April 3, 1917. Thomas listed the property for sale the following day and had completed the transaction by the end of the month. James Harker, who purchased the Whitlock property, made several modifications to the homestead, including demolishing what remained of the root cellar behind the house. In a statement given to investigators in 1952, Harker's son, William, recalled that his father had described the cellar as peculiar, deeper than necessary for storing produce, and divided into sections by interior walls. William Harker stated that his father had found several unusual items during the demolition, including a woman's hairbrush with dark hairs, still entangled in the bristles, buried approximately 2 feet below the cellar floor. According to William, his father had thought little of the discovery at the time, assuming it was merely discarded household debris. The Harker family maintained ownership of the former Whitlock property until 1933, when economic hardship forced them to sell during the Great Depression. The homestead passed through several owners over the next 2 decades, gradually falling into disrepair as the original buildings aged and newer residents focused on other areas of the property. By 1950, the house was largely abandoned, with local teenagers occasionally using it as a meeting place, giving rise to rumors that the property was haunted by a crying woman who could sometimes be heard on quiet nights. For the next several decades, the story of Eliza Whitlock's disappearance faded from local memory. The family's departure from the area, combined with the disruption of World War I and the subsequent influenza epidemic, pushed the unresolved matter into obscurity. It might have remained there permanently had it not been for a discovery made in 1952, when the former Whitlock property, by then abandoned and overgrown, was purchased by Walter and Ruth Simmons, a couple from St. Louis planning to establish a hunting lodge. According to a report filed with the Taney County Sheriff's Department on June 12, 1952, the Simmons were clearing brush behind the deteriorating house when they uncovered what appeared to be the collapsed entrance to an old root cellar or storage space. Upon closer inspection, they discovered a small leather-bound book wedged between 2 of the limestone blocks that had formed the cellar's foundation. The book, severely damaged by moisture and time, was identified as a personal diary belonging to Eliza Whitlock, with entries dating from January 1910 to February 1912. Ruth Simmons, who made the initial discovery of the diary, later recalled her first impression of the book in an interview with the Springfield News leader. The pages were stuck together, and much of the ink had run, but you could still make out the handwriting in places. What struck me immediately was the change in the writer's penmanship over time. The early entries were neat and controlled, while the later ones became increasingly erratic, as if written by someone in a state of agitation or fear. The discovery of the diary prompted a renewed investigation by Sheriff William Masterson. The contents of the diary, partially legible despite the damage, revealed a disturbing account of the final years of Eliza Whitlock's life. The entries, initially documenting mundane aspects of rural life, gradually shifted to express Eliza's increasing anxiety about her husband's behavior. In an entry dated August 14, 1911, she wrote, "T watches constantly, says the house is not secure enough. Speaks of dangers I cannot see. When I suggested visiting my sister, his face changed in a way I cannot describe." Another entry dated October 3, 1911, stated, "The children are forbidden to wander beyond the yard now. T has nailed shut the window in our bedroom. Says it is to keep out the cold. But the first frost has not even come." The diary's most concerning entries began in November 1911, coinciding with Harriet Bowman's visit. Eliza wrote, "The midwife came today. I wanted to speak freely, but could not with him standing there listening to every word. When she left, T said no one else would be permitted to enter our house. He says they bring contamination from town." In December, she recorded, "The new room beneath the house is nearly completed. T works on it when he thinks I am asleep. He speaks of it as a sanctuary, but it feels more like a tomb." A particularly disturbing entry dated January 8, 1912, reads, "I found Edward this morning standing at the entrance to the cellar, staring at the door. When I asked what he was doing, he said, 'A father says, we'll all sleep there soon when the time comes.' When I questioned T about this, he became enraged, accusing me of turning the children against him. He did not leave my side for the remainder of the day. As January progressed, Eliza's entries became shorter and more fragmented. On January 23, she wrote, "Tea makes me drink a tonic he prepares each evening. It leaves me groggy and confused the next day. I began pouring it into my potted plant when he isn't looking. The plant died within days." Another entry dated February 2 simply states, "I must get the children away from here. But how? The snow is deep and we are miles from town. T has hidden my boots and coat. He says it is to prevent me from falling ill, but I know the truth." The final readable entry, dated February 17, 1912, contained just 3 lines. "A found these pages tonight. His rage was terrible. The children are locked in their room. I hear him digging again." Based on the diary's contents, Sheriff Masterson ordered an excavation of the area where the root cellar had been located. On June 18, 1952, investigators uncovered human remains, later identified through dental records as those of Eliza Whitlock. Medical examination determined that she had suffered blunt force trauma to the skull prior to burial. The position of the remains suggested she had been placed face down in a shallow grave with her hands bound behind her back with wire. Dr. Lawrence Wilson, the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy on Eliza's remains, noted several additional details in his report. Wilson determined that Eliza had been approximately 32 years old at the time of death, consistent with her known age. He also found evidence of a previous fracture to her left wrist that had healed sometime before her death, an injury not mentioned in any known records. Most significantly, Wilson identified traces of a sedative compound in the preserved tissue samples, suggesting that Eliza may have been drugged prior to her death. This finding corroborated her diary entries about a tonic Thomas had insisted she consume. Following the discovery, authorities attempted to locate Thomas Whitlock and his children, but the investigation revealed that Thomas had died in a Kansas City hospital in 1931 from complications related to pneumonia. Edward Whitlock had been killed in action during World War II in 1944. Only Mary Whitlock, by then Mary Coleman, was still living, residing in Omaha, Nebraska, with her husband and 3 children. Records from the Kansas City Public Library examined during the investigation provided some information about the Whitlock family's life after leaving Taney County. City directories showed that Thomas had worked as a night watchman at a warehouse from 1917 until 1928, when health problems forced him to retire. Edward had attended school through the 8th grade before taking a job at the same warehouse. Neighbors from that period, tracked down by investigators, described Thomas as a strict father who kept to himself but was not notably unusual in his behavior. One former neighbor, Estelle Parker, recalled that Thomas never spoke of his late wife and became agitated if anyone inquired about the children's mother. Mary Whitlock had married Richard Coleman, an insurance salesman, in 1929 and moved to Omaha shortly thereafter. According to marriage records, she had listed her mother as deceased on the application, though no death certificate for Eliza existed at that time. This suggested that either Thomas had told his daughter that her mother had died, or Mary herself had chosen to represent her absent mother this way. When contacted by Missouri authorities in July 1952, Mary Coleman claimed to have no recollection of the events surrounding her mother's disappearance. She stated that her father had always told her that her mother had abandoned the family, and she had no reason to question this account. However, Coleman's husband later contacted investigators privately, reporting that his wife suffered from recurring nightmares about a woman calling from beneath the floorboards, and had always exhibited an extreme fear of enclosed spaces. Richard Coleman provided investigators with additional information about his wife's psychological state. In a letter preserved in the case file, he wrote, "Mary has suffered from what doctors now call anxiety attacks throughout our marriage. These episodes are often triggered by certain sounds, particularly the sound of digging or scraping, or by the sight of certain objects, including gardening tools and root cellars. For years, she has refused to enter our basement or any underground space. When I asked about the origin of these fears, she would become distant and change the subject." The investigation revealed additional details through interviews with former residents of Taney County who had known the Whitlock family. Clara Jensen, who had been a young girl living near Walnut Shade in 1912, recalled that her father had once encountered Thomas Whitlock in Forsyth, purchasing an unusual amount of quicklime from the hardware store. When questioned about the purchase, Thomas had explained it was for preserving the root cellar walls against moisture. Jensen also remembered hearing her parents discuss strange sounds coming from the direction of the Whitlock property late at night during that winter. Sounds her father had attributed to wild animals or the wind in the hollow. Jensen's brother Harold provided a written statement describing an encounter he had with Edward Whitlock in the spring of 1912. According to this statement, Harold had encountered Edward near the property line separating their family's lands. The Whitlock boy had appeared distressed and asked Harold if people could hear things through the ground. When Harold asked what he meant, Edward had replied, "Father says no one can hear anything through the ground once it's packed down tight, but I think I can still hear her sometimes." Before Harold could inquire further, Thomas Whitlock had appeared, calling his son home. Harold had mentioned the strange conversation to his parents, but they had dismissed it as childish imagination. Further research into Thomas Whitlock's background uncovered a possible explanation for his increasingly paranoid behavior in the months preceding Eliza's disappearance. Records from the State Lunatic Asylum in Nevada, Missouri, now known as the Nevada State Hospital, revealed that Thomas's father, William Whitlock, had been committed to the institution in 1890 after exhibiting violent paranoid delusions. The elder Whitlock had reportedly become convinced that his wife was conspiring against him with neighbors and had attempted to imprison her in their home. Hospital records indicated that William Whitlock died in the asylum in 1902, with notes describing a hereditary tendency toward paranoid ideation. The asylum records also contained a letter from Thomas's mother, Sarah Whitlock, written to the hospital director in 1895. In this letter, she expressed concern about her son's nervous disposition and inquired whether her husband's condition might be passed to their children. The director's response, also preserved in the file, assured Sarah that mental aberrations are not necessarily inherited, but advised that Thomas should be guided toward occupations that avoid excessive stress or isolation, suggesting that some familial predisposition toward mental illness was recognized even then. In October 1952, Professor Alan Matthews, a historian researching Ozark folklore at the University of Missouri, visited the former Whitlock property at the invitation of the new owners. Matthews documented the layout of the homestead and the location where Eliza's remains had been found. His notes, preserved in the university archives, describe the isolated nature of the property. The homestead sits in a narrow valley surrounded on three sides by steep wooded slopes. Even at midday, parts of the yard remain in shadow. The nearest neighbor's house, though less than a mile away as the crow flies, is invisible from the Whitlock property due to the intervening terrain. A person could scream here without being heard beyond these hills. Matthews also recorded local beliefs that had developed around the property in the years following the Whitlocks' departure. Several residents of Walnut Shade reported avoiding the area, claiming that travelers passing the abandoned homestead at night sometimes heard a woman weeping or the sound of digging. Matthews noted that such stories were typical of many abandoned properties in the Ozarks, but suggested that, in this case, they might have originated from actual sounds heard by passers-by during the winter of 1911-1912. In his field journal, Matthews wrote, "The acoustic properties of this valley are unusual. Standing at the former site of the root cellar, I conducted a simple experiment, dropping stones into the remaining depression and noting how the sound carried. Even a small impact produces an echo that reverberates between the limestone bluffs. It occurs to me that if someone were digging in this location at night, when ambient noise is reduced, the sound might indeed travel considerable distances, creating the impression of ghostly activity to those unfamiliar with the terrain." The case of Eliza Whitlock was officially closed in December 1952, with her death ruled a homicide attributed to Thomas Whitlock. Her remains were interred in the Springfield Cemetery, where her parents and sister were buried. The story received brief attention in regional newspapers, but was quickly overshadowed by larger national events. The Taney County Historical Society maintains a small file on the case, including copies of the original sheriff's reports, excerpts from Eliza's diary, and newspaper clippings related to the 1952 discovery. Among these materials is a transcript of an interview conducted with Richard Anderson, who had been a deputy sheriff under James Harmon in 1912. Anderson, in his late 70s at the time of the 1952 investigation, recalled that Sheriff Harmon had remained troubled by the Whitlock case long after the official investigation ended. According to Anderson, Harmon had mentioned the case on several occasions over the years, once remarking that, "Sometimes the law's limitations mean that justice must wait." Anderson believed that Harmon had suspected foul play, but lacked the evidence and resources to pursue the case further. In 1968, the last significant development in the Whitlock case occurred when Mary Coleman's oldest son, Robert, contacted the Taney County Historical Society requesting information about his grandparents. According to correspondence in the Society's archives, Robert had recently discovered his mother's collection of childhood drawings, hidden in their attic after her death from cancer earlier that year. The drawings, created when Mary was between 5 and 8 years old, depicted a recurring scene: a small female figure beneath what appeared to be floorboards or ground, with stick figures standing above. One drawing, labeled in a child's handwriting with the words, "Mama sleeping," showed a similar scene with what appeared to be a man digging. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, a psychologist who examined the drawings at the request of the Historical Society, provided a written analysis that is included in the case file. Mitchell noted that the drawings displayed several characteristics typical of children who have experienced trauma, including repetition of disturbing themes, use of heavy pressure when drawing certain elements, particularly the lines representing the ground or floor, and the placement of figures in constrained or buried positions. Mitchell concluded, "These drawings strongly suggest that the child who created them witnessed or was aware of a deeply disturbing event involving the burial of a female figure, presumably her mother. The consistency of the imagery across multiple drawings indicates that this was not a momentary fantasy, but a persistent memory or preoccupation." Robert Coleman visited the former Whitlock property in the summer of 1968, by which time the original house had been demolished and replaced with a hunting lodge. In a letter to the Historical Society following his visit, he wrote, "Standing on that ground, I felt a profound sense of sorrow, not just for the grandmother I never knew, but for my mother, who carried this buried truth her entire life. Some secrets refuse to remain hidden, no matter how deeply they are buried. Coleman went on to describe his mother as a loving parent, but always somehow distant, as if part of her remained locked in that valley in the Ozarks. He revealed that Mary had refused to discuss her childhood and had reacted with unusual anxiety when her children asked about their maternal grandparents. "Now I understand why," Coleman wrote. "She was protecting us from a truth she herself could not fully face. That her father, the man who raised her, had murdered her mother and forced her to become complicit in a lifetime of silence." The Whitlock case exemplifies a phenomenon that criminologists would later identify in numerous rural communities: the way in which isolation and privacy can enable domestic violence to escalate without intervention. In the early 20th century Ozarks, where homesteads were separated by difficult terrain and cultural norms discouraged interference in family matters, a woman like Eliza Whitlock had few options for escape once her husband's mental state deteriorated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and winter weather made travel nearly impossible. Even when concerns were raised, as by the midwife Harriet Bowman or teacher Abigail Thornton, the limited resources and jurisdiction of local authorities meant that effective intervention was unlikely. Professor Matthews, in a paper published in the Journal of Ozark Studies in 1954, used the Whitlock case to illustrate broader patterns in rural crime and community response. He noted that Thomas Whitlock's status as the male head of household granted him nearly absolute authority over his family in the eyes of the community. Neighbors who might have noticed warning signs were reluctant to intervene, adhering to the principle that a man's home is his castle. Matthews argued that this combination of physical isolation and cultural insulation created conditions in which family violence could occur with minimal risk of discovery or consequence. The psychological impact on the Whitlock children represents another dimension of the case that has drawn scholarly attention. Dr. Mitchell, in her analysis of Mary's drawings, suggested that the young girl had developed a complex coping mechanism to deal with the trauma she had witnessed. Rather than facing the unbearable reality of her father's actions, Mitchell wrote, Mary appears to have compartmentalized the experience, creating a psychological barrier between her conscious awareness and the truth she knew at some level. This fragmentation of memory is a known response to childhood trauma, allowing the individual to function, but at the cost of complete psychological integration. Today, the former Whitlock property is part of a larger recreational area. Few visitors know the history of that particular piece of land or the tragic events that occurred there. The limestone bluffs still cast long shadows across the valley, and at dusk, when the wind moves through the hollow, some say it carries echoes of the past. Sounds that might be mistaken for a woman's distant voice calling from somewhere beneath the ground. What makes the case of Eliza Whitlock particularly disturbing is not just the manner of her death, but the silent complicity that allowed her disappearance to go uninvestigated for so long. In the isolated communities of the early 20th century Ozarks, privacy was highly valued, and interfering in family matters was generally avoided. This cultural tendency toward non-intervention created an environment where someone could effectively vanish with minimal questioning. The diary found in 1952 provides our only window into Eliza's experience during those final months. Her growing fear, as her husband's mental state deteriorated, her concern for her children's safety, and her increasing isolation from the outside world. The entries suggest a woman who recognized her danger, but found herself trapped by both physical circumstances and social conventions that offered little protection to wives and mothers. Perhaps most haunting is the legacy of silence that continued long after Eliza's death. Her children, particularly Mary, seem to have buried their memories along with their mother, creating psychological barriers that protected them from confronting the truth. When Mary's drawings were discovered after her death, they revealed that some part of her had always known what happened, that the truth had found expression in her art, even as it remained unspoken in her life. Local historian Margaret Branson, who has studied the Whitlock case extensively, observed in a 2012 article marking the centennial of Eliza's disappearance. What happened in that isolated valley was not simply the murder of a woman by her mentally ill husband, but the murder of truth itself. Thomas Whitlock buried his wife twice, first in the ground behind their home, and then in a narrative that erased her existence and replaced it with abandonment. The children, too young to fully understand, but old enough to know something was terribly wrong, were forced to participate in this fiction, carrying the weight of an unacknowledged truth throughout their lives. The case reminds us that the most profound horrors often occur not in dramatic moments of violence, but in the slow erosion of safety, in the gradual transformation of home into prison, and in the terrible silence that can descend when those who should protect us become our greatest threat. In the deep hollows of the Ozarks, where sound travels strangely and darkness comes early, Eliza Whitlock's story reminds us that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary humans whose minds have turned against them and against those they once loved. For those who study such cases, the Whitlock tragedy exemplifies how isolation can magnify mental illness, how cultural norms can enable abuse, and how the truth, no matter how carefully buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. Decades since Eliza's remains were discovered, forensic psychology has developed tools that might have identified Thomas Whitlock's deteriorating mental state before it led to violence, and laws have changed to offer greater protection to potential victims. Yet similar stories continue to unfold in isolated places where privacy can still serve as a shield for the unthinkable. The limestone soil of the Ozarks eventually revealed what Thomas Whitlock tried to hide. But for 40 years, Eliza lay forgotten in her unmarked grave, her fate unknown to all but the man who put her there, and perhaps the children who carried the burden of that knowledge in their nightmares and their silence. In that silence lies the true horror of the Whitlock case, a silence that spoke volumes to those willing to listen. Dr. Samuel Hirsch, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the case records in 1960 for an article in the American Journal of Psychiatry, proposed that Thomas Whitlock likely suffered from what would now be classified as paranoid schizophrenia, similar to his father's condition. Hirsch noted that the onset of Thomas's symptoms appeared to follow the classic pattern of the disorder, with initial manifestations in his late 20s or early 30s, gradually increasing in severity. The progressive nature of his paranoia, beginning with general suspicion of neighbors, escalating to fears about the security of his home, and culminating in the belief that his wife was somehow contaminated or dangerous, aligns with documented patterns of untreated psychosis. What distinguishes the Whitlock case from many similar tragedies, Hirsch argued, was the extended period during which Thomas maintained a facade of normalcy after eliminating the perceived threat. Most familicide cases end with the perpetrator's suicide or immediate apprehension. Whitlock's ability to create and sustain an alternative narrative, that his wife had abandoned the family, and to function in society for nearly 2 decades afterwards, suggests a complicated relationship between his delusions and his awareness of social norms. He knew enough to hide his actions and create a plausible cover story, indicating that some part of him recognized that what he had done would be condemned by others. The children's response to the trauma they witnessed or intuited has been of particular interest to psychologists studying the case. Edward Whitlock's school records, recovered during the 1952 investigation, show a pattern of declining academic performance and increasing behavioral problems following his mother's disappearance. His teacher noted instances of what would now be recognized as dissociative episodes. Periods when he became unresponsive or appeared to be listening to sounds others could not hear. These symptoms suggest that Edward may have developed what modern clinicians would classify as post-traumatic stress disorder. Mary Whitlock's response differed from her brother's in significant ways. While Edward exhibited more obvious signs of distress, Mary appeared to adapt more readily to their changed circumstances. Dr. Mitchell suggested that Mary's younger age at the time of the trauma might have made it easier for her to compartmentalize her experiences. Children of 3 to 4 years old are still developing their understanding of permanence and causality. Mitchell wrote in her analysis, Mary may have been better able to accept the narrative her father presented because her cognitive framework was still forming. However, as her drawings reveal, the truth remained present in her unconscious mind, emerging through her artwork in ways she could not verbally express. The long-term impact of childhood trauma is further evidenced by Mary's adult life. According to her husband's statements to investigators, she exhibited several characteristics common to adult survivors of childhood trauma: chronic anxiety, specific phobias related to the traumatic event, particularly her fear of enclosed spaces, an aversion to digging sounds, and emotional detachment. Richard Coleman described his wife as loving but somehow absent, as if a part of her remained elsewhere. This splitting of consciousness, the ability to function normally in most aspects of life while walling off traumatic memories, is a recognized survival mechanism in trauma psychology. The intergenerational effects of the trauma are suggested by Robert Coleman's description of his mother's parenting style. In his correspondence with the Historical Society, he noted that Mary was intensely protective of her children to the point of causing conflict with his father. She would become irrationally anxious if we were out of her sight for even short periods. He wrote, and she had strict rules about certain activities. We were never allowed to play in the basement, for instance, or to dig holes in the yard beyond a certain depth. At the time, these seemed like arbitrary restrictions, but now I understand they were connected to her own buried experiences. The community's response to the Whitlock case reflects broader social patterns regarding family violence in mental illness in early 20th century rural America. When Sheriff Harmon investigated Eliza's disappearance in 1912, he was operating within a legal and cultural framework that placed high value on family privacy and male authority. Domestic violence was widely considered a private matter, rather than a crime requiring public intervention. Without clear evidence of foul play, and with Thomas presenting a plausible explanation for his wife's absence, Harmon had limited grounds for pursuing the investigation further, regardless of his personal suspicions. Similarly, the neighbors who noticed concerning changes in Thomas's behavior, his increasing isolation, the unusual modifications to his property, his agitated manner in town, interpreted these signs through the lens of their time. Mental illness was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized, often attributed to moral weakness or spiritual failings, rather than medical conditions requiring treatment. The withdrawal of a family from community life might raise eyebrows, but was not seen as justification for intervention, particularly in the Ozarks, where independence and self-sufficiency were cultural values. Even those closest to the situation, like Catherine Crawford, faced significant barriers to effective action. As Eliza's sister, Catherine had no legal standing to demand access to her niece and nephew or to compel a more thorough investigation of her sister's disappearance. In her journal, she expressed frustration with the limitations of her position. If Eliza were merely property gone missing, the law would take greater interest. But a woman who might have chosen to leave, that is considered her right, regardless of how uncharacteristic such an action would be. Dr. Elaine Foster, a criminologist who included the Whitlock case in her 1980 study of rural homicide patterns, noted that the isolated nature of the Ozark communities created perfect conditions for what she termed invisible crimes, acts of violence that remain undiscovered due to geographic isolation and cultural factors. In urban settings, Foster wrote, disappearances are more likely to be noticed and questioned. Multiple social connections create a network that makes complete erasure difficult. But in regions like the Ozarks in the early 20th century, a person could effectively vanish with minimal social disruption, particularly women whose social identities were often defined primarily through their husbands. Foster argued that the 40-year delay in discovering Eliza's fate was not merely a failure of investigation, but a systemic blindness to certain forms of violence. The story Thomas Whitlock created, that his wife had abandoned her family, was readily accepted because it aligned with existing narratives about women's unreliability and the difficulties of frontier life. She wrote, the alternative explanation, that a husband had murdered his wife, was both more disturbing and more difficult to address within the available legal and social frameworks. It was simpler for all concerned to accept the abandonment narrative. The physical environment of the Ozarks played a crucial role in facilitating both the crime and its concealment. The rugged terrain, with its deep hollows, dense forests, and limestone caves, has long provided hiding places for those seeking to escape notice. During Prohibition, these same features made the region ideal for moonshining operations. In the Whitlock case, the isolated location of the homestead, positioned in a narrow valley, surrounded by steep hillsides, ensured that unusual activities would go unobserved. The harsh winter of 1911-1912, with its heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures, further reduced the likelihood of unexpected visitors who might have witnessed concerning behavior. Professor Matthews, in his study of the property, noted that the limestone, rich soil of the region had inadvertently preserved evidence that might have otherwise disappeared. The alkaline composition of the soil, combined with the relatively dry conditions inside the collapsed root cellar, created conditions that preserved both the diary and, to some extent, Eliza's remains. He wrote, in more acidic soils or in locations with greater moisture, decomposition would have been more complete, potentially eliminating the possibility of identification decades later. This preservation of evidence allowed the truth to eventually emerge, bringing a measure of resolution to a case that might otherwise have remained an unsolved disappearance. When Walter and Ruth Simmons discovered Eliza's diary in 1952, they provided the catalyst for an investigation that finally revealed what had happened on that isolated homestead 40 years earlier.